were important. Those were essential elements of the relationship later in the match, right? So I found that very confusing. My confusion was alleviated when I met these people, Steve and Mary Agnes Hamilton, who were at Cornell. They're the ones who've been studying apprenticeships, programs of mentors who work with teenagers. And it was they, and don't they seem like nice people? They don't seem like the kind of people who would promote a prescriptive, nasty approach, do they? No, they got grandchildren. And they have grandchildren who their children will let them spend time with alone, so they can't be bad. So they came up with, and they had been talking about a completely different approach to mentoring style. Well, not completely different, as you'll see in just a second, but it was a different style, and it had not been sort of incorporated or utilized in most general youth mentoring programs. And this style was called the instrumental style. Now for them, instrumental mentors who were these adults working with high school students, usually around developing a skill, an apprenticeship-based mentoring relationship, their focus was on developing competence and character. It was more than just focusing on the specific outcomes. It was a broader commitment to the youth. It was illustrated early on by an intense focus on skill development and achievable outcomes, because the kids wanted to learn something, right? But what was interesting, and even the work that I had read of theirs didn't highlight this, in their research, they found that this style, the instrumental style, actually has three components. It starts off goal-focused, and then it becomes strongly relational, right? Out of, I think, the mentee feeling that the mentor has served an important purpose for them and validated their sense of worth by doing that and empowered their own skill development, they then entrusted the mentor with personal concerns. And so a relationship focus occurred later. And they had other styles that they saw. They had one style that was all relational. They had another style that was all goal-directed. And those weren't as good as this combined approach. But there's one thing that occurred in both studies that struck me. And it was this idea that the matches organized themselves around shared activities. The matches were, as Morrow and Stiles called them, in the missing slide you never saw, youth-centered. The mentors really focused on what the kids wanted, and they considered that as important as their own, as their own beliefs about what they should be doing in the match. Are you thinking about some of our cases here where they're trying to figure out what are meaningful activities, but they're really basing that assessment of what's a meaningful activity on what's meaningful to them? Okay. Oh, I've never had so many gizmos up here. Oh, I got to tell you, the reason this is so chaotic for me is my computer died. The first day of the trip, my laptop that I have carried around for 3 years just completely died. And we've been scrambling to get all the audio, video files and everything onto other people's computers to pull this thing off. And believe it or not, this is the smoothest transition we've had. So, the team framework tries to think about these two styles, the developmental and the instrumental. And it does so by looking at 3 dimensions. The first one is to break it down on those basic dimension of, are the activities relationship-focused, youth-focused, which are the top activities there, or are they more goal-directed, like in the apprenticeship activities, learning specific skills? But neither the developmental or the instrumental style were simply those, right? How did those two styles differ in how they used relational and goal-directed activities? What's that? They're opposite. In the instrumental, you start with goal-directed activities you agree upon, and then you become relational. In the other, you're relational, and you become goal-directed. She'd like a shirt, and I'm sure she'd like an extra large one. Or maybe you have one? How many of you have one of these shirts already? I don't want to discourage your participation, but it's kind of anticlimactic when we award you a shirt and you go, about from here on out, you just take the shirt and you give it to somebody else and you give a big smile on your face. You're throwing me off. All right. That was being goal-directed, by the way, in case you need an example. But another dimension gets into this notion of collaboration, which you probably picked up through Wayne's talk earlier about the importance of really hearing the youth's story and building on it, pulling from the youth what they're interested in, what they value, what they're concerned about, validating it and using that as a starting place for figuring out where your relationship and how your relationship will start and take place. I call it authorship, also collaboration, but I like authorship because I think in mentoring relationships, we're really talking about a story. I mean, over time, these kids are going to remember this relationship like they remember a story they heard as a kid, right? The question is that a story that they wrote, that they co-authored, or is it going to be a story about some adult who came in their life and did these things? So, to what extent have they co-authored this story of their relationship? Now, these two dimensions actually capture most of what we need to know, sorry, Wayne, about the two styles, instrumental and developmental. They're both collaborative, like they're at their best when whatever goal is chosen or whatever relational focus occurs, they both agree on. You know, what happened in my study, it appears, is that those mentors who arrive with a plan in mind to fix their kids, or arrived with a plan in mind for what they were going to do, or had a vision in their head of what a mentor does, implemented that plan, and that was very disengaging for the youth, I think. I don't think starting off goal-directed is actually a problem, but it was here because I think it generally reflected this idea that I'm working with this kid who's at risk and I need to help him, right? Which is a problem because the kid knows immediately, you're not mentoring me, you're mentoring some problem in your mind. I'm not even here with you. You don't know who I am. And I remember a kid saying, in response to a mentor who had lots of ideas of what they should do, you don't know me. Who's this mentor to tell me that we need to talk about this stuff? You don't know me. Whereas the next year, there was that girl who said, she knows me. Why won't she help me? When she was ready. But I think a lot of folks. Now, I got to get back to the gender thing. Sorry. But one of the things that really struck me is that when we looked at the prevalence of goal-directed and relational activities, when we averaged those activities, you see right there, we saw that from elementary to middle to high school, the proportion of time spent doing those things went up fourfold. It went from 5% to 12% to 20% by high school. And it was always about 20% higher among boys than among girls. Now that means that in elementary girl matches, the focus on goal-directed stuff in the first year was only about 6 or 7% of the time. But in high school, for boys, it was over 20% of the time. Now, that's not all the time, but I think one of the things that we're going to talk about here in terms of interactions is quantity and quality matter when it comes to what you do. You know, there are those moments in a relationship that just touch you, right? And so you feel moved by that person. That person doesn't have to move you constantly for you to feel like that person cares about you and has made an impact in your life. They don't have to be constantly doing that. But conversely, there are also relationships where just a few interactions have been almost devastating to the relationship or to you, right? So even though at high school it was only a fifth of the time that these male matches were engaging in this, I think that was enough for those males to say, enough of this. I don't need another adult in my life telling me that there are problems with my grades, my attendance, my behavior, and think about my future. So these kids started skipping and missing the matches, and they got worse. In fact, when we measured to what extent the mentees felt valued, using a scale, you don't care who created the scale, but a scale on how much you feel valued, we found the exact opposite of that staircase. The kids who felt most valued were the elementary boys, then elementary girls, middle school boys, middle school girls, and then there was a swap where the boys went down to the bottom and the girls were a little bit higher in high school. So those folks who engaged in these goal-directed activities at the most, right, felt least valued. And it paralleled the gender stuff in ways that I think we need to think about specifically because we have a problem recruiting men for mentoring, right?